G'day hobbyists, Anthony from AOS Coach here, and welcome to a new series of videos that we're going to be putting out every fortnight, every month, every week. I guess it depends on how long it takes to nail some amazing guests. At the moment, the schedule is every fortnight, and we have a bunch of awesome guests locked in to talk all things Age of Sigmar and at the same time do some hobby. And, you know, this is really a hobby and hangout session where, you know, the goal's really to put aside an hour to an hour and a half of your day, listen to some really interesting insights from very, very knowledgeable people in the community, but also ask questions, get involved, and yeah, so I think we'll have a lot of fun. And in the first video, we are going to be joined by the one and only Clint Mallet. Clint has an amazing long list of achievements that you will never hear from this guy. This guy is our true Australian Warhammer hero. He is the organizer of CanCon, Australia's largest Age of Sigmar event. Not only is it large and amazing, it also smashed the records when it came to us versus LVO, which happened at the exact same time. So to outrank the Americans with, you know, with a small team is a massive kudos. But Clint is also one of the lead producers and you know, a very sexy, smooth voice over at the podcast Heralds of War. So I want to introduce my guest, Clint Mallet.
Howdy, and you clearly don't listen to the podcast if you think I have a smooth, sexy voice.
And I also think that you know that I listen to the podcast because I'm always one of the first people to comment and provide feedback.
Oh yeah, I know that. Yeah. You just need your hearing checked. Also, hello everybody.
Yeah, I'm one of the first people to give feedback, and I remember actually when I was at Blood and Glory, and Heralds of War put out a podcast with a former co-host, Jesse, where he was talking about Warhammer Fantasy players getting over it and moving on. I remember being in the hotel room in Derby, like writing up the world's biggest response on yeah, a bit of nerd rage. But
that you did. You must have cut it back to comment on it, and then I made you put your money where your mouth was and had you on a couple of episodes ago to talk about moving on. So
yeah, and by no means is this you know, this is me bringing Clint on because he adds tremendous value. Not that there's any side deals or any brown paper bags being handed around, or at least if there are, I haven't gotten my brown paper bag yet. So
yeah, no mountains of cash in silver briefcases or anything like that.
So what I'm going to do is let's flip over the cameras. Let's go to the hobby stations, and yeah, so grab your paintbrushes, grab your tools. I'm going to be working on Morghast Archive. Actually, no, Harbingers. So I'm going to be working on some Morghast. Clint, what are you working on today?
I am working on Skarak, the Forge World Greater Korgrath, Exalted Korgrath. The big dude, as you can see here. He's quite large. It's like 160 mil base, so he's fairly big. And there's a lot going on, lots of skulls, as you would expect. But I'm just kind of working my way through painting him for a chap named Chris Welfare. So.
I hear he's also an amazing podcaster.
Yes. Chris is the host of the Mortally Wounded podcast, and yeah, he's also a TO as well. So, you know,
Chris,
just doesn't paint his models.
Chris, I'll get that brown paper bag when I attend Sydney Slaughter in June. So get ready for that cash for that plug. Thank you, mate. I think it's a bit hard to pry money out of hobbyists these days, especially when Iden of Deepkin about to drop.
That they are. They're floating on in this weekend, aren't they?
They are. If you are joining us, you know, just after the show's put out, yeah, absolutely. Deepkin, we're going to be deep diving into them as of Saturday. Ooh, puns. So I guess who is Clint? I guess that's the first thing the community probably needs to know. Like, who is this bloke that I've got on the cast?
Well, me, obviously. But yeah, Clint is a guy who crazily likes to run events, and loves Age of Sigmar probably more than is healthy. Has loved Warhammer Fantasy in the past, probably almost as much. Been playing the game for 18 years or something this year, since 2000. And it decided that when Age of Sigmar came out, that it was finally time to do a podcast as well. So I finally had something to contribute, so to speak. I'd thought about doing it previously and just felt I didn't have an angle. So yeah, AOS dropped. I thought, yep, let's do this. And Herald's was the first Australian dedicated AOS podcast. So
that's an amazing achievement. And you've been going on for what, a couple of years now?
It will be 2 years next month.
I feel like we're gonna have like
Yes.
a birthday party or a celebration, or tell the wife that you're going out for an anniversary date with the podcast. Like, I feel like you need to celebrate.
Maybe. There's a fair bit that happens in May in our household, so it'll probably get lost amongst, other important things like wedding anniversaries and birthdays and things. So.
I mean, looking at the schedule last year, I think your partner is definitely forgiving, and maybe spending too much time with the hobby, you might lose some of that leniency.
Well, I've definitely taken the foot off this year. I did a lot last year and felt it, so this year is a bit more restrained. So.
For anyone who isn't quite clear on what happened last year, there was, I think if I, correct me if I'm wrong, Clint, at least in Australia, we saw a massive boom. It was like the gold rush of events, and there's a lot of touring around the country, especially around the East Coast, where Sydney and Brisbane probably travelled a lot. You came down even to support the Mother of All Battles, where you didn't play, you just sat there, yourself and Dennis, and a lot of travel last year. I think I travelled a fair amount.
Yeah, I think last year being the first big year of sort of tournaments in Australia, yeah, lots of people travelled around, and I think we've all kind of just taken the foot off somewhat this year.
So, what was the first model that you purchased and put together?
Okay, so when my group of mates and I decided that we were going to start doing Warhammer, we went down to our local store. We don't have a Games Workshop here in Toowoomba. We're not big enough yet, and I went down to our local bookstore with my friends and picked up a blister pack of Fellbats, or as they would call then, because they were still called vampire bats at that stage.
That's pretty old school.
Yes it is.
That's very...
Blister pack, two metal ones, and they're still kicking around here somewhere as well. I think they're in my unbuilt drawer over there.
Oh, you've still got them?
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Not that I haven't built them in the last 18 years. I've built them, painted them awfully, as people do when it's their first models. And then some years ago, I stripped them back, and I've just not rebuilt and repainted them because I already had a bunch of other Fellbats and such as well, and don't use them that much. So.
Amazing. One thing I'd love to know is, what's your favourite paint? Do you have a favourite paint?
I have a favourite paint. You wouldn't think of it looking at my army. My undead army is all purple. But probably my favourite paint is... It's going to be either Sotek Green or Temple Guard Blue. A turquoise colour.
And how do you rate yourself as a painter? Are you, if on a scale of 1 to 10, we're talking, 1 is you're a gimp, 10 is you are golden demon, and a 5 in the middle is tabletop standard that would get you lots of points at CanCon. Where do you sit on the scale?
I'd probably say a 6.
You're a 6.
Maybe a 6.5 if I put my mind to it.
Yeah, I think...
if I take the time, really.
Yeah, I'm not a patient painter either. I'm very much get it on the table as quick as possible, and well, for me anyway, get it on the table, play with them. Actually, that's probably a really good question. Are you more of a painter or a player?
I am a mixture of both. I am an everyman, a jack of all trades, so to speak. Part collector, part painter, part player, part wisher, I guess. Wishing that I could do more of all of those things.
Yeah. Don't we all? Quit our jobs and live the dream. Just got to find the money to buy paints and hobby and pay bills, I guess.
Well, your hobby to pay bills. That's how it works.
Yeah. And so you said you're currently playing Death. Are you still playing Death at the moment, or are you playing something different, or like where are you? Or what are you working on currently?
So I have played Death a lot. I think I played them pretty much all last year, except for a brief foray into Clan Pestilence, which I painted up to take to an event and played a few games with, and went, actually, this army style probably isn't me, and sort of moved them on. But yeah, mainly Death last year. This year, I thought, right, I'm going to do something different, and I sat down and I built 2,000 points of Scourge Privateers, which are the old school Dark Elf Corsairs.
Yep.
And those sorts of things. And I took them to a games weekend at Hayden's the other week. Hayden Walker from Brisbane. He threw a little thing, and a couple of us from Tournament went down. I took them there and had 2 very much known games, and was just about ready to put them all in the bin. And then I took them to a local event this weekend just gone, and lost all 3 of my games there again.
So is it fair to say they're not coming out of the hobby cabinet for a while?
They have been relegated to painting project status, not gaming project.
All right. Well, do you think Idoneth Deepkin and their ability to ally will see them given a second chance?
Not from me. I don't intend to buy Idoneth, so that's probably not from me. I know I've talked to some folks who are looking at the Corsairs as a sort of thematic chaff unit that they can ally into the Deepkin, because with their the Forgotten Nightmares rule or something that Deepkin have, where the enemy can only shoot the closest unit or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's the closest visible enemy model or unit.
Yeah, the way that's worded seems like implies that it doesn't say Idoneth unit.
Yes.
So, like, allied in Corsairs, which are going to be, I think, the cheapest allied units or something like that, they're going to be very useful for screening, elite shark riders and stuff like that. So
I have heard some people talk about potentially allying in concussors or some of those Dracoth type riders, and knowing how hard they are to take down, and just kind of seeing them up the battle board, and knowing that they have to be shot at currently, with the wording.
I can see that. Like, if you wanted it to be super resilient, but they're also really expensive. And it looks like that some of the Idoneth are probably going to be fairly elite as well. So I'm not entirely sure that you want to add an elite unit into an elite army as chaff.
Yeah, no,
you know what I mean?
for sure.
Yeah.
I love the speculation already, and the book hasn't even dropped yet. So if you're listening to us, this is Wednesday, about 3 to 4 days before we get it in store, and we're already theorizing about the cheese tactics.
People were theorizing 3 weeks ago. So.
I know. So you're talking about playing Hayden, playing a bit of a hobby day. Tell us about some of the most recent games you've played.
Well, most recently was that local event, and playing the Scourge Privateers. Played Nagash led Death. I knew that I couldn't win unless I killed Nagash, and I didn't kill Nagash, so I was a little bit disappointing. And then I think I played Mixed Chaos. Wes, who's a local guy, he's fairly, I wouldn't call him new, but he's probably still within his first 12 months of AOS. He always brings armies that are just full of all the different stuff that he loves.
Yeah.
Which I find really good to play against, because it's not not a net list or the latest filth or anything. He just goes, I like this unit, and just builds an army around it. So that with my Corsairs, and then I played Daughters of Cain, and they are brutal.
Did you play Temple Nest? Did you play the one that has that crazy 5-up rerollable save?
I played a Temple Nest with Sisters of Slaughter as one of the other battle line choices.
Ooh.
Yeah, it was pretty full on. Yeah, I quite like him, and you sort of ask what I've been working on, and a Temple Nest was one of the things that I thought about, and I put to Twitter poll about what my next project should be. The Corsairs were what won that, but that's not happening now. Yeah, but Temple Nest was one of the options.
Do you think you'll go back against the Twitter poll and actually do them, or?
Well, it's the second option in the Twitter poll that I will probably pursue now. So, which was Undead Orcs.
Ooh.
Produced by Titan Forge Miniatures.
Oh, that sounds super fascinating.
So it's still an army that I know back to front, but I'm making another Death Army. Yeah, I know, but it'll look different and be cool to see all painted up on the field.
I imagine, I haven't seen the Titan Forge models. I'm only imagining what it might look like, and it reminds me and takes me back to the Dogs of War, and I think there was a unit called the Curse Company where it had some undead Skaven, undead orcs, undead, maybe even a lizardman.
He had an undead Saurus in there.
Yeah.
Kruger and his Cursed Company. I have Kruger himself, who was the human dude who was in command of it. I've got he's a White King in my army, and I kind of have the other command there as well. I'd love to sort of expand it out and make it like a Graveguard unit.
Yep.
With the little undead gobbo drummer and stuff like that.
Wow. Well, make sure you're putting up pictures on Twitter, because I think I would love to see that.
Yes, well, when I am made of money, because they're flipping expensive these days. Yeah.
We're not talking Australian prices. We're talking generally expensive.
Yes, not the. Can we not talk about
That
that?
I was going to say that's a very popular topic for people that you're talking about, is just the general whinge of prices in Australia.
And it drives me up the wall.
Yeah, there's obviously other economic factors to consider, but hey, that's not why we're here. We're here to talk about tournament organising, the confessions of the diaries of a tournament organiser, and one of the reasons that I wanted to get Clint on this chat as well is, Clint, I'm sure you have noticed, just like a lot of people, that 2018 and even 2017, there has been more events than there ever has before. And, as the year progresses, there seems to be more and more tournaments, but also more and more people that want to get into the tournament scene and potentially even running their own tournament. In fact, I ran my very first tournament or event this year. That was a part of the Coalescence and Malign Portents, and it was such a learning experience for me. I drew inspiration from yourself and other TOs, but it was also a big learning curve. So, I'm hoping to draw from the experience and the wisdom that you have over your many years of tournament organizing to, share those best practices and, what are those booby traps that people might fall into. So this might be a good time to actually get into the topic. So really, Clint, I want to know, what made you actually take the plunge and go from player to tournament organizer?
Okay, so this is a long-winded story, but I'll try and shorten it as much as I can. So in Toowoomba, where I live, where there's like 120,000 of us, and during 8th edition there were two very distinct 8th edition gaming groups that ran their own events. One was sort of based around our local store, and the other one was more independent. And there was all sorts of bickering and infighting and things like that, and neither of them did it quite the way I thought it could be done. So I'd been to the local Toowoomba events, and I'd been to events run by the Queensland Northern Knights, which are a gaming group that's based out of Caboolture, just north of Brisbane, and they had some really well-run, smooth events, and I went, yeah, I want these in Toowoomba. And we had a bit of an issue where one of the TOs had organised an event and sort of cancelled it the night before, saying that he couldn't get keys to the hall or something like that.
Yeah.
Some other players didn't get the message, turned up, and the hall was full of old ladies having a bring and buy. So some shenanigans had gone on there. That chap disappeared off the radar for quite a while, and my friend and I had previously considered that we would run an event soon, and that was our catalyst to go, right, let's do that. And so, yeah, I decided in March that I would run a 2-day event here in June, and set about making tables and terrain and all that sort of stuff, never having done it before. And then ran a little 2-day event here, and the weekend that it was on happened to be the weekend that the first pictures of AOS leaked.
So this was pre-AOS. This was
pre-AOS. This was 8th edition. Yeah.
Right.
Right at the tail end. Yeah. Yeah. Literally the Saturday morning, there were the first grainy white dwarf picture leaks of Age of Sigmar, and shiny gold things, and corn, because they looked like corn. But that's what everybody was talking about, not tournament, not this, not that. So yeah, that was circling round to your question, which was why did I take the plunge, is because I wanted to run an event that I wanted to go to. So just well organised, as organised as it can be, with a TO who didn't play. Like one of the groups here, the TO would play as well, and he'd get somebody in to put in scores, and they had no idea what they were doing, or it was interesting times, and I didn't really like that, and neither did my friend. So yeah, we decided to do it ourselves, and I got the bug.
And I think we're all very thankful that you did. because I can tell you right now, the events that you've run are ones that I've wanted to play in, and I think once you attend an event you really enjoy, you carry the baton, and if you get the chance to be a TO, you try to incorporate some of those best practices from the events, but equally you kind of avoid some of those pitfalls. So you've talked through the first event that you run. Tell me a bit more about, you mentioned earlier that you don't have a local games workshop, and some people like to, leverage that games workshop. There's a customer base, there's a manager who can help you. They've often got terrain, and, you mentioned that, you had no terrain, you had no base. Tell me about the Toowoomba scene. Tell me about the local friendly game store. And tell me about the partnership that you've gone on to create with them.
So when I first started running events, they didn't. They supported us. I'd talked to the guy who was running our local store, which is Battle Station at the time. His name was Mike. Fairly nice chap. But they didn't. I don't think we borrowed any terrain from them or anything like that. They were they had run their own events and things like that. So I was kind of standing on their toes, but not at the same time. Since AOS has dropped, that's kind of changed. The store's changed hands. They've moved premises now. They have, I think it's 12 gaming tables now, where they used to have like 4. And one of the owners is a guy I went to school with 25 years ago, since 25 years ago, and one of the people who I got into Warhammer with. So, as you can imagine, I have a fairly good rapport with him. So, these days, the local store are very strong supporters of the various scenes, not just AOS. They're very strong supporters of all the different games, whether it's cards or miniatures or that weird mix that things like X-Wing are, miniatures and cards and whatnot. But or even D&D and things like that. So they're very strong supporters of the local community itself and the events that I run and things like that. So
how would you, I guess, I'm putting myself in the shoes of a new tournament organizer. You've got a game store that, you frequent, and, they've got the space, the potential at the player base. You don't have you've never run an event there, or, there's an opportunity to run events there. What advice would you give somebody to that first initial conversation with the game store manager, or, the person who owns the premises?
I think the important thing is to realise that the game store is business. So you've got to come at it with, yes, all game stores want to grow the community, but they're also a business. So you have to kind of put it in terms that they will appreciate. So it's like, can I use all these tables one Saturday, and all your Magic players can't come, and we'll get outside sponsors or whatever? That's never going to make you friends. You need to work with them to make sure that the event is beneficial to the both of you. I think that's an important thing that some people kind of forget about local stores. I suppose working with them to make sure that the event works for both of you is a big thing, and just talk to them. It's quite likely that if you go to a game store all the time, the bloke behind the counter's name, he knows you, he knows the armies that you play, you've had lots of chats, because we're all, gamers like to have a chat about what we love, and if that's Warhammer, and the people behind the counter also love Warhammer, chances are you've had a good long chat with them, and you just say to them one day, look, can I please run an Age of Sigmar event here, in a month's time or 2 months' time or whatever, and just asking the question is often going to get you places.
Yeah, and and I think you touched on the commercial aspect and recognizing and appreciating that for some game stores, I know every month in Sydney we play at a local gaming store called GamesCube, who are very big on Magic the Gathering, big supporters of 40k, big supporters of X-Wing, and Age of Sigma is just one of many games that they need to consider, and people they're trying to grow the hobby with. So always recognizing how am I adding value is always something that I think we're conscious of, and being aware of other players. So I'm glad you call that out. It's a huge risk if you're not going in thinking about that commercial aspect.
Yeah. Game stores want to grow the community, but they also want to grow their bottom line.
Yeah.
So, and things like, if you're doing prizes or whatever like that, making sure that prizes are either bought from their store or are store credit for their store and things like that. Making sure, I know it's a big thing, like at our local store, they have a fridge full of drinks and snacks and things like that, but when we run a local event, we'll order in pizza, but we try and we guide people to the drinks fridge. Go and buy a Coke while you're here, or throughout the tournament and things like that, and that just always helps. But yeah, make sure you get your prize support from the store that you're in. I don't know, I'm saying it now and it seems really obvious, but that it is an important thing.
No, it's so true. And I mean, your local gaming store may not have the best prices, or maybe you can get it cheaper going online. But being conscious and aware that they're supplying the tables, they're the one who's paying the rent, they're the one who is paying insurance, they're the ones who are putting the lights on, and ultimately you're also stopping them from having those Magic players or those 40k players who come in on a Saturday and a Sunday. So making sure that it's mutually beneficial has to be critical. Otherwise, I'm imagining that you won't be invited back.
Very much so, yeah.
How else could you be mutually beneficial? So we've got prize support and in-store vouchers. We've got purchasing of drinks. Is there any other ways that we could be mutually beneficial to your hobby store?
Well, I suppose it's we've kind of both assumed it, and I think you mentioned it earlier on, but just it's assumed that you're actually shopping at this store on a regular basis. Because gosh darn, if you rock up to just a random store and say, look, I want to do this, then you could be asking for tears before bedtime. I tell you what. Look, I'm not entirely sure on other ways off the top of my head. Do you have any?
One thing that just came to mind is so Evan, who runs the RCGT or the Redlands GT that happens in like late in the year. He does a wonderful job, in my opinion, of spruiking his supporters, whether it's the sponsors, whether it is the location, and making sure they got press time in, whether it's emails at the end of the tournaments that kind of you might thank them for their support, making sure that they're a part of any discussions, or maybe even some the award ceremony. I've always thought that works really well, just as another reinforcement of thanks for your support. It's been wonderful. Let's do business again.
Yep. As soon as you said that, I'm like, oh yeah, that's really obvious.
Because you do it really well.
It's
but
one of the things that I also do. But yeah, no, he does really well because he does videos and stuff.
Yeah, and that was kind of what drew me, because he does like these hype videos. And he's always blasting email and social, and obviously you don't want to annoy everybody, but I think he's got a nice balance of promoting and it shows, because this year his tournament is 6 months away, I think, and he's already got some big names locked in, and it blows me away.
Yeah, and I know for a fact he's working hard on the players pack for his event, hoping to get that out very soon to people. So,
would you ask a store owner, like, you know, about like what would they like out of the event, or would you ask them about, you know, what do you need to make this successful, or is this something that you'd probably try to work out beforehand?
oh look, you can always ask them. I think that's a good idea. Just saying, look, you would generally ask them once they've sort of agreed that that was what was going to happen, that you were going to be doing the event there, and you can say, well, you know, I'll organise the prize support through you. You know, what else do you want me to do? You know, you're cool with me, you know, plugging you on social media a lot, and you know, is there anything else that you needed? So I think that's possibly after you've got your foot in the door, but being mindful of the fact that you may need to mention it as you ask.
Yeah, it's critical, because when I think of again, I think about the Games Cube monthly tournament. We take up probably almost the whole gaming space. So Games Cube, I think, has about, let's say, 20 tables, and we'll take up most of those tables. So I think about from I guess a profitability point of view, and you know, what does this store, you know, outside of the Age of Sigmar tournament, you know, how much money does this store bring in on a daily or on an average Sunday? For me to take over his tables and own the space, how much revenue do I need to bring into this store? And how can I supplement that? Obviously, I can't command, but also I remember, you know, there was a time where, you know, we were taking over all the tables, but then attendance started to drop. So we couldn't have an exclusive event. You know, we had to welcome Magic players and anyone who comes in, because we weren't bringing up enough revenue. And I think appreciating that as well, and recognizing that, again, this is a business.
Yeah, very much so.
So, you know, let's say I guess we're breaking down the process. You know, I've got this idea that I want to run a match play or a narrative event. I've got something in mind. I know the local store is supportive. They're open to my idea. When should I start preparing, you know, the tournament, you know, or the event? You know, is this something that, you know, takes months, weeks, days, you know, for the best, you know, event?
I'm possibly a terrible person to ask this, because I am an obsessive worrier about things going to plan. So I'm already planning CanCon for next year. So and it's a good 9 months away. But my answer to that question can't be 9 months, because that's a bit ridiculous.
So let's imagine. So I mean, CanCon is over 100 players.
Local event.
Let's say a local event.
I was getting there.
All right.
So, as soon as you've locked it in, you need to get yourself like a Facebook event up, or a poster, or if the store has some sort of page or website or whatever, you need to get it up on there, and you need to start talking to your fellow players about it.
Yeah.
Depending on the size of the event is whether you need a full-blown players pack or not. Keeping to our... I just realised I can't see, sorry.
I just find when you open your eyes, it helps.
No, I had the light swung away before for the open camera, like for the face shots, and I didn't swing my light back.
Oh.
So that's why I was finding it dark. Sorry. Yeah, so with our example of the local store tournament, probably just having a think about the way that you're going to run it, you know, putting up in the Facebook event or the website or whatever, just saying how many games and how much it's going to cost, which is something else that you'd have to plan. Um, and with that, you're figuring out, are you going to provide people with lunch, or whether you do pizza, or I have in the past run events in a hall
Yep.
and had somebody come in and cook burgers for folks. That went down a treat. Everybody could smell it in the run up to the end of the round, and then lunch was on, and everybody really appreciated it. But you've got to factor in feeding people if you're going to do that as part of your ticket price.
Yep.
Then how much you would like to go into sort of a prize pool for your prizes. So whether, if you're charging $20 for this tournament, $5 of that is for, half a pizza, or, 7 is for a whole pizza or whatever. And then the rest goes into that prize pool, and you know that if you get this many people, you can give out prizes for first, second, and third, and things like that. So figuring out how much you're going to charge people and getting that in front of folks, along with how many games that you're going to be running. It's typically, it's a one-day event, so it's probably 3 games.
Yep.
Of the standard, in quotes, standard AOS size of 2,000 points. Maybe you can get more games in if you're going for a smaller size. I've done that before.
Speaking on food and prizes, let's say the event that I want to run is 20 players, big or large. That might be small to you, might be large to you, depending on where you are in the world. But let's say 20 is the head count that I'm looking at. Do you budget and plan accordingly to have all 20 spots filled? Or are you more like, at worst case, 15, 10 people rock up, and then kind of go from there? Like, what's your take on that?
Well, yeah, in this particular example, you look, and that it changes. It's going to change from scene to scene. You might have a group that is really reliable, and you know that you're going to have 16 to 18 people turn up at least, because that's just the size of your scene. So you can kind of work to saying, okay, well, I'll have this many people come, and food will cost this, so I should have this much left over for prizes. Or if you have genuinely no idea, and sometimes that's the case, you don't know who's going to turn up. So you just leave it very loose and just say the prizes based on attendance, and I think people can accept that. People are probably going to be used to that, because if 5 people turn up and you're charging them $20 each, including lunch, first prize can't be $100 worth of store credit. It's not going to, the way that's going to happen. So I think leaving it loose on that kind of thing is probably a good start for your first couple of events, especially as you start to build up that player base, that regular player base.
Yeah, I imagine, and I know when I was running my first tournament, there was a risk that if I announced too many prizes early on, I'd be on the hook to buy these prizes out of my own pocket, and there's always that risk. So announcing some of the prizes and kind of building them out, or keeping them secret, just saying, look, first, second, third, I'm not going to tell you the monetary prize, or whatever it works out to be. I know I found that very, very flexible approach really helpful for me.
On the coming out of your own pocket thing, nobody's ever going to make money running tournaments. It's just not going to happen. I think, it depends. It depends if you're running them at a store. If you're running them at a store, you're not going to have any overheads. But if you're running them at a hall or something like that, you're going to have overheads, and just be prepared to not make any money or break even.
Yeah.
My first event, I think I was a grand grand in the hole on, including terrain and boards and stuff. And it took probably 2 years to sort of.
Yeah.
So,
hey, do you just want to repeat? So you just went like Mr. Roboto just then. Do you want to repeat? So you were $1,000 in the hole. It took you 2 years to recoup. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the first making boards and terrain and stuff. Yeah, it was about $1,000 down. $1,000 loss on the first event, and then the subsequent events eventually paid the cost of the terrain and stuff back. But that's probably not such a concern in this particular games store example. But if you are running it in a hall or something like that, it's you know you're going to have to spend money on this thing. That's just unfortunately the way it is.
I guess, for yourself, you were in it for the long run. So, dropping the $1,000, while it is a significant amount of money, you knew you could recuperate those costs over time. It wasn't just a one-off event. You were going to continually use these boards. So,
right. I will disagree with you there. I didn't know whether it was going to work or not.
I just see you as a natural TO, so I imagine that you were ready to quit your day job and be a full-time TO, roaming the country, running events.
Oh,
no?
If only that would be better than what I'm doing at the moment. No.
we won't let your employers hear that.
That was as much as I was going to say there. Look.
Okay, so when you bought this stuff, you didn't even think about like future state that I'm going to run a couple of events a year. It was just what you did.
It was just what I was doing, and if it worked well, then I would do it again, and if not, I would think about that at the end of it.
Yeah. I know when I ran my event, one of the things that, drove my location was how much terrain did they have, how many boards did they have, so I could reduce the costs or even having to build and paint terrain. That's just another thing that I had to worry about if I had to do it. So that might come into play. Are you going to do it in a hall, or is there somewhere that you could leverage people's terrain, store terrain, maybe even ask people to bring their own terrain to an event just to ease some of that pressure, both financially and from a time point of view?
Yeah, yep. In our particular example, we've kind of got the store on board, so you're probably pretty lucky in that respect. And stores are pretty helpful.
They are absolutely, as long as people are respectful. And one thing that I know from a couple of the in-store tournaments that I've been to is just because the tournament's over doesn't mean you just kind of pack up your models and go home. If you can help pack up even some of the terrain and leave them blank board, it always is appreciated.
Yep, I'll second that. And that doesn't just apply to store events. That applies to everything.
Yeah. I'm always packing up at CanCon, always giving you a hand.
Yeah.
While I'd love to socialize with everyone who's traveled, I think it just makes if everyone can put away a few boards and a few pieces of terrain, it just makes the whole process a lot smoother.
Yeah.
Speaking of CanCon, I'd love to know from a personal point of view, when you heard that our event was larger than the Las Vegas Open, what were your thoughts? What were your feelings? Talk me through that.
I have to remember now. I remember being fairly ecstatic because it was. Look, I was already quite happy with CanCon being the size that it was. Biggest AOS event in the Southern Hemisphere at that point. And then to find out that we'd pipped this event at the LVO was pretty amazing, really, because I had thought for sure. The Las Vegas Open, for folks who don't know, is primarily a 40k.
Mm-hmm.
They had like 500 40k players there, so. But I had thought that AOS was still going to be a fairly big part of it because of the size of the overall event. So to find out that we'd beaten that was quite amazing. And then when we sort of mentioned it during the awards, the cheer was really quite loud.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, I'm very proud of that moment. Just because I've seen how much work has gone into the local communities and the different states running their own events, rallying. I think about Sydney and a gentleman in our community called Sean. He built the Age of Sigmar Sydney Facebook page and did a lot of work to bring the different groups together, to build relationships and rapport and, build that community. And when I now look at, the events that we attend, I can see that work, that community spirit we're reaping the rewards. And, I think we had people all over the country attend, from places that I wouldn't have even expected attending.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, kudos. And I think, I'd like to see it definitely grow into the, could I see it at the size of Adepticon, South Coast GT, at that 150, 200 player range. I know I have aspirations. I know you dread the idea of running a 200 player tournament.
Well, I think I'd kind of decided that next year was going to be 150, like Pokemon.
Yeah. That went over my head.
150 Pokemon.
Yeah.
That's originally, when I was a child, that's originally how many Pokemon there were. 150. Well, 151. Never mind.
Still went over my head.
Somebody will appreciate that. I'm sure Mr. Brewer will appreciate me mentioning Pokemon on here.
If you like Pokemon and Clint's right, leave it in the comments. I that certainly went over my head.
These days there's 300 or 400 or something. I don't know. Look, CanCon next year, I think 150 players is definitely doable.
Mm-hmm.
It's an extra load of terrain. It's an extra bunch of boards, as provided by Mr. Travis. Again, if I beg and scrape and generally tell him how wonderful he is, maybe that will happen.
Travis, this is a warning, buddy. We're going to need your help. More tables. Stop making those amazing glass ice-looking bases. If you guys don't know Travis, he's an exceptional painter. His Twitter handle is Thonius. Check.
Thonius. 83.
I'll leave it in the show notes, and you guys check it out. So I guess I've only got a couple more questions that I probably wanted to ask, and I'm sure you've got other things to do. Although hobby and chat, we could probably do this forever.
This guy's got a lot more to go. So ask away.
I'm only starting these Morghast, and I've got to get them done in 2 weeks before. We've got a 2,500 point battle coming up, and I've decided to start a new army as opposed to run my old army.
That old mistake. Chestnut.
Well, it was going well. I was building a Flesh Eater Quartz army, and it was all going well until Legions of Nagash dropped and just absolutely grabbed my attention.
Yeah, it'll do that.
But actually, this is probably a nice little lead-in question. So I'm furiously painting my army to at least a 3-color minimum, so I can attend and have more of my toys on the table. And I know you are a stern advocate of making sure that there is a minimum painting standard of 3 colors plus bases done.
Stern advocate is a polite way of putting it. Yeah.
Talk me through. You want to have this high standard. Why do you have this standard? And if somebody didn't meet this standard, or you had to pull somebody up, what's the advice? How do you handle that situation?
Okay. Well, clear. Yeah. So, first CanCon that we ever ran, I wanted to definitely set a standard for the event, just for CanCon at that stage, but it's kind of become a standard across a bunch of other events, that people will get to play against painted models. You know, especially in Australia. You know, some of these folks are. I know personally to get to CanCon is like a 14-hour drive for us. There were folks coming from South Australia and Victoria. Well, first CanCon was South Australia and Victoria and Brisbane and things like that. And I would hate for them to travel and rock up and be playing against an army that's half grey plastic, because not only would that suck at a local tournament, definitely sucks if you've come halfway across Australia to do it. And yeah, I decided that we would sort of have a 3-colour minimum, and that unpainted models will be removed from the table. And
have you had to enforce that?
Yes. Round 1 of CanCon last year, I had to enforce that. A chap had a unit where some of them were only primed, and I said, you know, as per the players pack, those will need to come off because they're not painted. And he took the models off, and I haven't had to ask anyone since. So people got the message that I was enforcing that, and it's not been a problem since.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, I remember I actually did have to play one player at one of your events, but you were playing at the time, so Mark and Jesse were running the event at the time, and I think the gentleman had half a painted army. And I know it was a bad experience for me, it was a bad experience for him, and it was probably a bad experience for the TOs having to kind of tap this guy on the shoulder and say, hey mate, your army's not painted, you've got to pull your toys off the table.
Yeah, I think I remember that. Oh, that was BrizCon last
year. It was BrizCon.
Yeah, that was a bit of an interesting event that was, organised by me and run by Mark and Jesse, and I remember the army in question, and like the bottom half of the model, like the mount was painted but the riders weren't, or something like that. So it was all sorts of wonderful technicalities and things like that. But it's not a great experience. But I think that particular chap will turn up with painted models next time, but entirely painted.
Yeah.
So I think, I just look. I've said that a lot, so I'll try and rein that in. Painted armies look better on the tabletop. They look better with the terrain. And last year, CanCon, the AOS at CanCon was about proving that we had a good community and growing the game, and having all painted models and good tables and things like that, and people having fun was part of that, and it's part of showcasing the game and showcasing our community and how great it was. And I didn't know half the people in it at that stage, not even probably a tenth of the people that I know now. It was already good then, and it's only gotten better. But enforcing the strict painting standard is about making sure that the game looks good for the people who are in it and the people who are watching, and showing off the best of the community.
Yeah, I know. With my event, I didn't set a painting standard, and the reason for that was my goal was to bring more players into the event scene. I think in Sydney, and this is probably true across the whole world, is that there are players that you can probably often rely on to be at most of the major events, and there's the players that will always be there. But then you've got this large group of players who may only interact with you on an occasional basis. And, for me, I wanted to bring new blood and, give them a really good first experience, and to try to remove that barrier of entry to say, well, look, if you don't have a fully painted army, that's okay. Obviously, painted looks better. obviously mine wasn't a national tournament. It was more of a local narrative event that still drew 24 players. But I guess, I think about, what's the goal? Painted is better, but know that if you are going to set that standard, I guess you want to get your tournament pack and your communication out ASAP so people can paint their armies if they don't meet the standard. I guess, CanCon being an annual event, there is no excuse. Every year, if you want to come to CanCon, you need to have a painted army, and you have a year to paint it.
Yeah, definitely. And I would never enforce unpainted models will be removed at a local event in the store. In the events that I've run at the store, that's not a requirement at all, because that's just about, when I run a local event, it's a fun day. It's not a national GT or anything like that. Yeah. I know when to pull back from that paint standard.
I thought it was good to call out because when you remove those paint standards, you find interesting armies. I know Dan Brewer had run a doubles event late last year, and without a painting standard, that allowed me to run a 1,000 point devoted of Sigmar, full flagellant and war, priest army. However, my army's not fully painted, so if that restriction was around, then the diversity of armies may be reduced, or you may not be able to do those crazy armies like I ran.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and previous events that I've run that have been doubles and things like that, I've not included paint standards because people do take different armies and things like that.
So I guess the message that I'd want to get out is know your audience, know what you're trying to get out of the hobby. If you're trying to showcase, the best of your community, as Clint's talked about with CanCon, then enforcing that painting standard will just amazing photos. Everyone who travels will have a great experience. But if you're doing something smaller, maybe you want to ease up on them or not be as strict, and maybe incentivize them with prizes, but don't you can still let them play. I guess is what I'm hearing, Clint. Is that fair?
That's pretty much it. Yeah, even just in a local event, even if you want to encourage people to paint some of their models, that might be one of your goals, is to get people to actually paint their models that they keep bringing to all these things. And you just say, you must have a 3-color minimum to win prizes. So that if they just want to turn up and play on the day and just have fun, then they don't have to have their models painted and whatever. But if they want to walk home with something, a shiny voucher or a little medal or something like that, then they've got to paint their models. And then you can introduce those progressively over a series of events to make sure that the community as a whole brings their paint game up. Because I think that's important.
Yeah, definitely knowing your audience. If you have a group that's quite new to Age of Sigmar, maybe you don't want to set up that 2,000 point tournament that's over 2 days. If you know that your community is a little bit older and they've got kids, maybe they can't set aside 2 full days for your event, so maybe a 1-day event. Or LVO and Sydney Slaughter, for example, have great custom scenarios, but if your players are new to the scene, maybe making your games not as complex, or maybe allowing more time to play these games would be beneficial. But I guess if you're in a community that's very experienced and super adverse, they're across the whole rule set, they're using mysterious landscapes, they are absolute weapons, then you can set those 2 to 2.5 hour 2,000 point games with a high painting standard, and these people are they know what to do, and you don't need to coach them as much. So I guess know your audience.
Yeah, it's a very big thing.
Speaking of painting, and there's often a lot of debate around soft scores and the place that soft scores have in the tournament and the event scene. do you believe in soft scores? So I guess for the people who don't know what soft scores are, you've got your points that you score for winning the game, whether it's a major or minor. If you have secondary objectives, those points. But then you've got other things such as, bringing a display board, submitting your army list on time, these softer type scores. How do you feel, Clint? Do you include them in your packs? Why do you include them in the packs? What's your take?
Okay. Definitely a proponent of soft scores because I believe that the hobby itself is more than just gaming. And so painting is an aspect of the hobby, which is why I reward it. And sportsmanship, look, there's hours and hours and hours of debate about sportsmanship in wargaming and wargaming events and whether it has a place and all that sort of stuff. If you ask me, absolutely. I've been on the receiving end of bad games, more so in previous editions of the game than AOS. I think I've only had one really bad game of AOS in an event. But I believe that sports scores are really important to maintaining maintaining that nice, friendly atmosphere that we have. Not that I'm saying that it would all go away if I suddenly turned around and stopped having soft scores. I just think it helps. Serves as a reminder to people that it is a game and there's two of you there and both of you should have a good game.
Yeah.
And I kind of get round the old score your opponent from 1 to 5 with a checklist of sportsman things, Did they turn up? Did they, were rules queries handled politely? Did they try and bend the rules, or did they know all their own rules, or things like it's a checklist of sort of 5 things, or 4 things rather, and then sort of a miscellaneous plus or minus that you can add or remove a sports point depending, like if there's a bad aspect to the game that isn't satisfied by the previous points, you can pop that in, and or if it was one of your better games and you believe that the opponent deserved that extra tick because they're a legend or they really helped you out or whatever, then you can give them an extra tick. And I just think that I think it's really important to reward that, and that's why I include the sports scores in all my packs, and best sports voting, and best sports, best opponent trophies, and best opponent prize values are generally some of the higher ones in events I run because I believe it's really important.
Yeah, I like the idea that instead of giving this, this number that ranges from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, and everyone's interpretation of a sports person is gonna vary.
Yep.
By giving some guidelines to say, well, hey, did your player turn up on time? Were they constantly checking their mobile phone? Were they slow playing? Giving them some guidelines on what a good player might be, and why you would give them 5 out of 5, or how they would accrue maximum points. It gives me, the player, some guidance on, well, how should I conduct myself at an event if I want to gain those sportsmanship points, but also gives me a nice criteria on how do I assess my opponent. They might be a lovely person, but maybe they were slow playing, and maybe the feedback for me is as a free guild player, for example, I often have over 100 models on the table. Maybe people think that I'm slow playing, and it's not me tactically trying to be a dick. It's me just having to move my model. So if if that's causing a bad negative experience for my opponent, maybe I should think about finding either faster ways to move my army around, movement trays, or bring lesser models. So my opponent doesn't feel rushed to kind of complete all their actions because they're that they're sacrificing their time for mine.
Yeah. Yeah. I will just mention that the checklist idea was one that I borrowed from an event pack. Once again, coming back to the Northern Nights and their events, they used a checklist, and I always found that really good. So when it come time to start doing my own events, I chatted to one of their guys and said, look, can I borrow this from you and run away with it? And they were pretty happy for that to happen. So.
Speaking of inspiration, where do you draw your inspiration as a TO? You've mentioned Northern Nights a few times. Do you look at anybody internationally? Do you are you looking at the Neos to see how they run their events? Like where do you find your inspiration from?
I certainly pay attention to all of the other events that are happening around the place. Keep a close eye on how South Coast gets run, and LVO, and like the key thing I took from LVO and AOS and 40k there, and even stuff that happened at Adepticon was don't use Best Coast pairings. Because it just keeps crashing on folks. That's by the by, but I just keep an eye on things like that and see what can work for me and what won't, and what works for the Australian scene and what doesn't. I've mentioned Northern Nights a couple of times. The guy who used to run their fantasy events is a guy named Jacob Connor, and he just smashed it out of the park all the time, and he is one of the reasons that I run events now, is because he did it in such a way that it was organised, it was well run, it was smooth, everybody had fun, and then that was quite good. He was, if people have been to my decent sized events before, you'll have had a little results booklet. He was one of the people who did results booklets, and I went, yep, this is a really good idea. So.
I know I drew inspiration from Steve Wren, again from Blood and Glory, and the way he did his Warhammer achievements in the narrative event, where that checklist of different in-game mechanics that you would score points. And I think to your point, it's if running an event is important and you want to have a great experience, doing your research, looking at what the big guys are doing, looking at some of the smaller events, and looking at their player packs. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Clint, you had reached out to, was it the person who ran Adepticon to ask them about their point scoring? Did I see that on Twitter?
Yeah, and I was actually, once you were finishing what you were going to say, I was going to actually mention that don't be afraid to reach out to these people, because they are just humans that run events. Don't do it on the weekend. Leave it for a bit. So the story with the scoring is that we ran into probably one of my worst nightmares at CanCon, and we were running behind because scores were taking longer to put in than I had thought that they would, and they were taking longer than I'd kind of allowed myself to get them in, and I hate running behind. I hate running into unexpected problems, and the software that we were using was single user input and all that sorts of things. And it's a package called WarScore. And I got really excited when I saw that Adepticon were using WarScore. And so or the AOS event at Adepticon were using WarScore. And so I was really excited, and I wanted to talk to them and see what, whether they'd had, a multi-user input, figured out a way to do that or whatever. But I waited until I think it was about 2 weeks after Adepticon before I asked.
Yeah.
Because you definitely don't want to be hitting them up during an event or even in the week after, because they don't care. Yeah. Anyone who's run a decent sized event will know that afterwards you just want to turn off for a while.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I approached Alex Gonzalez on Twitter, and and sort of said, look, I noticed that you guys used this, and how did you find it, and how did you manage to get 170 results in the time that you did, and what are your secret, did you find a secret button that lets you put two people inputting at once or something? And we had a good chat about the way that they did it and things like that. And so next year we'll be implementing some of the techniques that they use to make sure that their events run on time. These are folks who have experience running huge events. Their events are more than 100 people traditionally for the last number of years. Don't be afraid to ask them how they do something, because more often than not, they're going to be they're going to be happy to help out other people, because at the end of the day, we all just want to make the scene grow.
I think everyone learns from each other as well, right? Like you.
Oh, definitely.
I remember Ben Curry talking to me and saying that he'd drawn inspiration from the way you run the Masters and implemented that kind of structure in the UK. So I think this is everyone's sharing their ideas. As a community, we're growing, and instead of everyone feeling through the dark, let's leverage the experience. Which is why we have Duncan's painting videos. Instead of me trying to learn a new technique, I can learn from somebody who really knows their stuff. And much like every tournament organizer, or story writer, there are communities. So I guess find the communities and don't be afraid.
Definitely don't be afraid.
I guess the last question I have before we start wrapping up is, what's the best story, or when you think of your time as a TO, what are some of the warm fuzzy feeling moments that you've had? Whether it's something you've seen happen between players, whether it's feedback you've received from attendees, what are some of those stories that at the end of the day it validates that all of this work was appreciated, and people have walked away feeling awesome?
I probably should have prepared for.
On the fly, honest.
Well, I'm gonna have to think, aren't I?
Have you seen or heard of any good, amazing sportsmanship stories? Let's start there.
Amazing sportsmanship stories. Look, they happen all the time. And often I don't get to hear about them until much later when they're being talked about. If I had to pick something, and I'll pick an overall kind of thing, it's the fact that CanCon last year was so many people's first event. And they all had such a great time that probably 90% of them came back this year, and the 10% that didn't had good excuses as to why they didn't. That they just had so much fun at an event that they felt that was something that they wanted to do all the time. And I think I'd like to hope that in part it was the way that I ran the event that helped that. I guess that's a very broad one. Stalling for time while I think of something more specific.
No, and if it's nothing that comes to mind, I think that's a wonderful testimonial of, CanCon last year was 50 odd players, and then this year, there's over 100. So, and it was my first tournament. I think we spoke about that on the podcast on Heralds of War, and the great experience that I had. I went back to my community and told them, and spread the love, and I brought a friend or two And that's how communities grow, is that, you leave somebody with a wonderful impression, you're professional, you remember why you're doing this, and that's for the growth of the game and the enjoyment of the player, not for your ego to show off how amazing you are. And ultimately these things grow. And CanCon is just one of the many examples that we've seen, that events starting small and they've gotten big.
I've got one. Maybe not sportsmanship, but something really awesome coming out of events that I've noticed, or events that I've run. And we'll go back to the teams event at Moab and the Fairy Princesses of Hish, who were 4 guys who didn't really all know each other, that came together as a team on the weekend, on that particular weekend, and they all played Warhammer as a team. They conducted themselves as a team to the extent where they had the pink shirts, the fairy wings, the wands, the little fairy objective markers, and they had the little pre-matchup fairies where they all put the wands in. And It was 4 blokes who all played Warhammer, and they were all kind of bound by this common thing, even if they didn't know each other, and they just formed this team. And I imagine that they're all probably good friends now from that, and that kind of thing, that kind of team, the way that an event brought those folks together to become friends, because you make friends at events all the time. It's just what you do. You're in a room full of people who all have the same hobby as you, so you're bound to find somebody who you can actually talk to and not want to kill. But when it's stuff like that, where people kind of go a little bit further as far as the bonding and the spirit, I guess. Sorry, that was a bit rambly, but it was something that popped into my head as a really great example of the way that events have kind of, I guess, brought folks together. Yeah, sorry.
No, mate. There's no need to apologise, and I think that's a nice way to end the cast, and maybe a reflection for people again who are thinking about events is, how can you bring your players together, especially for people who may not know each other. This might be the first time they're meeting, and you want to start those relationships, whether it's a name badge, whether it's we all shared lunch together, it's that pizza moment, and we're all eating pizza together. Is it a post-event activity, like a bingo, or go to the pub afterwards for dinner? How can you start to foster those relationships, and the sportsmanship we talked about is important, but equally, how can you bring these stories to life? And the fairy princesses were an absolute. They were amazing, because one thing that Clint didn't talk about was they actually were on a stage as well. So not only were they dressed up in their tutus and their tiaras and their wands, and they're absolutely having a riot, but also they were on a stage where we were all gaming on a stage for Age of Sigmar, and the X-Wing players and the bolt action players were on the floor. So constantly these people in costume were being looked at all the time, but they owned it. They absolutely owned it, and you do see those relationships flourish. So, Clint, is there anything else you wanted to add about being a TO before we kind of wrap things up?
Well, kind of building on that and fostering relationships and things like that, it's amazing. I wonder sometimes if I wouldn't have made as many friends were I not a TO. Like, if I just went to events, would I have as many friends in the community as I do now? Because you get to interact with everyone, and you get to talk to everyone, and you get to end up, like, I haven't amazing number of friends and people I talk to now that I probably would not have had if I wasn't a TO. If I hadn't have been the one that they all had to talk to and chat with, and then you kind of go further than just how did your game go into, as you were sort of saying, having the dinners and things like that and catching up with folks. So if people are wanting to be TOs and things like that, be prepared to make extra friends, because it's that's one of the really good things about it. Personal growth, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I enjoy nothing more than coming to an event and not only meeting new people, but also seeing people that I haven't seen before, or haven't seen them for a long time as well. It's nice to be able to go in and not just know the people that I've come to the event with, but like, hey, here's Blake, here's Hayden, here's Luke, here's Billy and Joe and Mary, and every man and his dog. I've gone out, and if I don't know somebody, attempt to make an effort to get to know, introduce yourself, or ask people about themselves, and there's likelihood you're going to interact with them on the internet or at a future event.
Yeah, and it just gets said in a lot of podcasts and things like that, but don't be afraid to go up and talk to people, because as I've said a couple of times, we've all got something in common. We've all got Age of Sigmar in common, and if that's where your conversation starts, then that's fine. But you just never know. Yeah. Absolutely.
Like a post event, I've Paul Aikens, and I now know this guy he's not in my community. He's from another Warhammer community, but he's a wrestling fan. And I went to a wrestling event recently, and he asked me about the wrestlers, and like, am I going to this next event, and all of a sudden we've gone from knowing one thing about each other to now two things, and I'm sure that's going to grow over time. So make yourself open to these experiences and these relationships.
Yep.
All right, we're going to wrap up. Clint, do you want to show off what you've done, or do you want to go back to your lovely face?
Calm down. Showing off what I've done is a bit pointless, because I suppose there's a lot more gold on him than there was, and then I've just gone around blocking in the grey armour.
Great. Chris?
Yeah, nothing that you can really... Where are we? We good? We good with focus?
Looks scary.
Yeah. He's a big model, and there's all sorts of wonderful bits and pieces that I'm yet to glue on him. His two sort of gauntlets, and he's got a weird little hood thing, and a rib cage covered in skulls, and a loincloth, because you've got to have one of them. So he's a big model, and I'll get there. It's just taking time.
I look forward to fighting him on the table at some stage, Mr. Welfare.
Mr. Welfare, yeah, he'll have to run Chaos. Cool. So, yep. So
all right.
I turned off that light before.
Well, Clint, thank you for sharing your advice and your knowledge. If people do want to chat with you and ask yourself some questions, I have down below Clint's Twitter account. Is there anywhere else that?
Is it there?
It'd be like to your right. Yeah, no, it'd be like probably it's somewhere around there. Yeah. But so is Twitter the best place to get to you, or anywhere else?
Yeah, Twitter's the best place to get a hold of me. I check it an unnatural amount of times a day to just see what people are doing all around the world. So, yeah, at Heralds of War, which you can see down there. You can follow me there and send me DMs if you've got questions, or hit me up or whatever. It's all good.
Great. And you obviously found my YouTube channel, guys. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, it's down below as well. So it's just there. Clint, thank you very much for your time, your wealth of knowledge, as well as the hobby chat. I know I certainly learnt a lot, and also, even if I didn't run another tournament again, a greater appreciation for the TOs out there and the amount of blood, sweat, and tears that go into running an event that I get to attend and thoroughly enjoy. So thank you for running events. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, and hopefully you get to play some games as well as TO.
No worries. Yes, no, so Sydney Slaughter, which is probably the next time I'll see you.
Awesome. Yeah, well, you've called me out, so now I've got to come.
Yes, you definitely have to.
All right, guys, thanks for hanging along with us. If you're here till the end of the stream, thanks very much. And we'll have some new guests. If there's someone that you want to kind of flag out in the community, something that's going on in your local scene, reach out on Twitter. This isn't Australia exclusive. Happy to chat to everyone in the community and find out all the great stuff that's going on. Clint, thanks again, and we'll speak to you next time.
Cool.
See you guys.
Next time.
Bye.